When Max Carter stepped out of the shadows next to Wawona Covered Bridge on a cold, early October morning, he was barely recognizable. Barefoot, painfully thin, his face gaunt and drained of life, wearing nothing but torn scraps of fabric. The man had been missing for 2 full years in the most rugged and remote parts of Yosemite's wilderness, an area where no one could survive more than a few days without proper preparation. But the most terrifying thing wasn't his ravaged body. What sent chills down everyone's spine were the things Max said about those 2 years, about the person who had held him captive, about what he was forced to do, and about the reason even he himself couldn't fully understand why he was allowed to return. Some names and details have been changed to protect identities and privacy. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of the latest cases. On the morning of June 12, 2022, the stone-paved parking lot at the Mist Trail trailhead in Yosemite was still wrapped in the lingering chill from the night before, not as grim as winter, but cold enough to make early arrivals feel the tense quiet of a mountain morning. It was in that setting that Max Carter closed his car door before starting the hike he had been planning for weeks. Max, who grew up in an urban environment where comfort was the norm and trips rarely went beyond family outings, saw this solo hike as his first real step toward true independence, after a long period of remote work and a life with little real-world friction. According to witnesses who left the parking lot around the same time, Max appeared more prepared than necessary. He wore a brand-new waterproof jacket and carried a completely new, high-end backpack overall, giving the impression of someone very confident but lacking real backcountry experience. The route Max registered at the ranger station showed he planned to hike from Mist Trail up to Nevada Fall and return the same day, a popular route not considered dangerous if started early and kept on schedule. Witnesses who were on the same trail that day later stated that Max moved very comfortably on the initial sections, occasionally stopping to check his phone or take photos of the waterfalls below, sometimes walking more slowly while trying to find cell signal in an area where Mist Trail is famously known for having almost no reception. By early afternoon, visitor numbers thinned out as many people began heading back down. It was around this time that an independent witness reported seeing Max standing near the viewpoint overlooking Nevada Fall. Next to him was a large, broad-shouldered man, whose walk carried the distinctive posture of someone with a military background. The witness couldn't hear what they were saying but remembered the strange contrast between Max's relaxed demeanor and the rigid, almost expressionless attitude of the other man. That was the last verifiable sighting of Max before all traces stopped. At 6:40 p.m., Max's phone sent its final data signal and then went completely silent, no further location data or activity of any kind. His family, accustomed to receiving a safety check-in text from Max after each leg of a trip, began to worry when the clock passed 8 p.m. with no message or call. By around 9 o'clock, they tried calling repeatedly, but the phone was off. Worry quickly turned to action when the time exceeded Max's expected return to the Happy Isles trailhead by nearly an hour. By 10 p.m., after considering every possibility and failing to make contact, the family officially reported him missing to the National Park Service, providing all relevant information about his planned route, physical condition, and level of outdoor experience. The case was logged as urgent, but no criminal investigation was immediately opened because the initial data showed no clear signs of foul play beyond Max simply failing to appear at the expected time and place. At that moment, all authorities had was the planned route and the last known time his phone transmitted a signal, the starting point of a wilderness missing person case with far too many unexplained gaps. As soon as the rescue forces received the missing person report, the SAR team launched the search following the exact route Max had registered. They began by thoroughly sweeping the entire Mist Trail, starting with the most hazardous sections, such as the slippery granite slabs near Vernal Fall and the steep slopes adjacent to the waterfalls, areas where hikers have frequently slipped or lost balance, followed by the narrow paths leading up to the Nevada Fall area, where visibility is constantly limited by rising mist and spray. Search teams were deployed along each section in layers, according to risk level. One group specialized in checking cliff edges where someone could slide off. Another surveyed damp rock surfaces for scratches or scuff marks, and another team approached the dirt areas beside the trail, looking for shoe prints, drag marks, or any ground disturbance that might suggest Max's direction of travel. The helicopter team began sweeping the valley, using thermal cameras to detect any unusual heat signatures against the cold evening terrain. Drones were launched to survey dense tree canopies where human access was difficult, and K9 units were brought in from the opposite end of Mist Trail to maximize scent detection in the rocky, mossy, and highly humid zones. During the first 48 hours, no visual evidence related to Max was recorded. Thermal cameras detected no body heat signature, consistent with an adult human size. Drones found no discarded gear or clothing on the rocks, and the dogs were unable to pick up a sustained scent trail strong enough to establish a clear direction of movement. The only recorded find was a single shoe print off to the side in a muddy patch near a side path, but the size did not match the shoe size Max had listed in his registration file, so the scene analysis team could not use it to establish any new search direction. It was considered possible that the print belonged to another hiker who had strayed off route, or to someone who had left the registered trail entirely, since at that time Mist Trail still had fairly high visitor traffic. When no signs were found on the main route, SAR expanded the search into the thick forests immediately adjacent to Mist Trail areas, where the dense canopy made aerial observation almost ineffective, and numerous unmarked side paths turned the zone into a place where anyone who veered off could easily become trapped. Survey teams pushed deeper into the informal user-created trails that had formed over many years, checking thick brush, low boulder fields, and dark pockets of forest heavy with the smell of damp earth, looking for every possible indicator: broken branches, small drag marks, faint footprints, or any personal item that might have been dropped. Low-lying areas or chaotic rock piles were examined with extra care because of the possibility that a person could trip, fall, or become wedged without being able to send a clear signal. Some teams focused on secondary trails that ran parallel to or crossed Mist Trail, since many hikers have the habit of turning onto less traveled sections to avoid crowds, creating unpredictable situations if they lost their bearings in the woods. The expanded search generated a large volume of terrain data, including the location of every point swept, GPS coordinates, detailed descriptions of soil and rock structure, and weather conditions in each area, all recorded to ensure no duplication among the round-the-clock rescue groups. By the 7th day, SAR began shifting its approach, moving from an emergency rescue search objective to a scene evidence collection phase due to the absence of clear signs of survival. Specialized teams started recording streamflow rates along sections of Mist Trail, the degree of moisture on rocks that could affect trace preservation, the depth of adjacent valleys, wind speeds that might interfere with hearing or visibility of a person in distress, and the overall terrain structure at all high-risk points. Every swept area was marked on the National Park Service digital map, compiled together with high-resolution drone photographs and thermal camera logs, so the technical team could evaluate the plausibility of Max having entered or exited that zone. The systematic documentation allowed cross-referencing with any evidence discovered later and ensured that the entire area within the radius relevant to Max's registered route had been surveyed at least once using multiple methods. The search teams completed their assigned sectors without finding sufficiently strong evidence to establish a specific direction, but the large body of terrain data they collected became a critical foundation for identifying the most likely relevant areas in the missing person file and for providing analytical baselines whenever new information needed to be compared. After 10 days of uninterrupted effort by the search team, during which all key areas had been surveyed using multiple different technical methods, the case file was re-evaluated according to the park's classification standards, with an important note that no clear signs of criminal activity had appeared, yet there was also no solid basis to completely rule out human involvement because of the unusually silent scene, the complete absence of biological traces, and the fact that no personal items of any kind were found that could be explained by a natural accident. The evaluation report also described that the manner of Max's disappearance did not align with a typical fall, because none of the locations where an accident was plausible showed any disturbance of the ground or rock surfaces, nor any of the usual signs that follow an impact. Max's family repeatedly submitted requests to expand the search and urged the deployment of additional personnel to unexplored areas, including the dense forest south of the waterfalls and lesser-known trails. However, the command team could not expand operations when all collected data not only lacked direction, but also contained no relevant elements that could help pinpoint a reasonable coordinate. Continuing the search under those conditions no longer complied with standard search and rescue protocols and could not justify the additional use of helicopters, drones, or ground teams without new data. The prolonged time naturally led to a state of operational standstill as required by regulation. And when the 12-month cycle ended with no new developments, the case was officially moved into the NPS cold case category. This meant all related data was transferred to the federal archiving system, where every piece of information is linked to automated cross-referencing mechanisms, including image databases, identification data, GPS records, and law enforcement reports from multiple jurisdictions. The entire search process was fully documented with photographs from helicopters, drones, and thermal cameras, combined with GPS coordinates and timestamps to form a comprehensive technical file capable of reconstructing every surveyed area. Each image file was preserved in both raw and analyzed formats for the purpose of future terrain cross-referencing in cases requiring geophysical analysis or environmental change assessment, helping determine the possibility that an object had been obscured or moved by natural factors such as water, wind, or rockfall. The SAR team also compiled a list of areas that could not be accessed due to excessively hazardous terrain conditions. Deep rock crevices completely shaded by tree canopy with insufficient light, sheer vertical cliffs, too eroded to allow safe rope descent, or extremely dense brush zones where the interlocking vegetation layers made advancing even a few meters highly risky. These inaccessible zones were marked with special symbols in the technical reports to ensure that if new data emerged, those areas would be prioritized for any terrain reevaluation process. When the file was updated into the cold case system, all documents including witness statements, technical reports, terrain scan maps, and patrol team data were standardized into a unified structure to guarantee that every element could be retrieved and cross-referenced in any context related to Max's disappearance. The file was also forwarded to the NPS Special Investigations Group, the unit that handles long-term missing persons cases within national parks, an agency with deep access to various federal data sources, including identification records found in other states, law enforcement reports, information from neighboring ranger stations, and unsolicited reports from hikers. Throughout the first year after the file was transferred, the Special Investigations Group recorded no analytically valuable leads because the entire collected dataset produced no internal connections to any similar events in other areas. Terrain analysis also yielded no noteworthy points, as all plausible accident zones had already been swept, while the inaccessible areas were too vast to speculate about without clear indicators. The final summary table stated that the case had fallen into a state with no investigative foothold. No physical evidence, no new witnesses, no unusual reports from visitors, and no technical indicators that would allow any inference about Max's direction of travel or final location. The entire situation was documented as a complete disappearance within a natural environment with no supporting clues, leaving the file in a state that was informationally closed, but procedurally open, a fully documented yet completely directionless cold case, reflecting the extreme difficulty of tracing someone in complex terrain with absolutely no interaction between the victim and the environment at the moment of disappearance. 2 years after Max disappeared from Mist Trail, on a June morning with thin sunlight filtering through the pine forest, a road maintenance worker for the Wawona area was driving past Wawona Covered Bridge to check the water level of the South Merced River when he spotted a figure staggering right at the edge of the wooden structure. The walk was unsteady, as if both legs could no longer support the body, and as the vehicle drew closer, he realized this was not an ordinary hiker who had slipped. It was a man in extremely severe physical collapse. The clothing on him was filthy, torn, and faded, in the way that comes from long-term abrasion. His hair was long, matted into clumps. His beard grew unevenly. His eyes were sunken, as though he had endured months of sleep deprivation, and his skin had a pale gray tone covered by a thin layer of dust, giving the impression that no one could reach such a level of exhaustion merely by being lost in the wilderness. The worker quickly got out of the vehicle and, upon approaching, realized the man was completely disoriented about time, had no idea where he was, and did not even respond when asked his name. He only muttered disjointed sounds, could not stand steadily, and had to lean against the bridge railing to keep from falling into the water. On his left arm were multiple layers of old and newer bruises. Around his wrists were clearly visible deep, dark grooves resembling marks from prolonged restraint by cord or binding, and on the back of his right hand was a deep skin crack, where dried blood had formed a thick layer, a condition indicating the body had gone without care for many months. Recognizing the level of danger and the signs of acute physical collapse, the worker immediately called 911, reporting that an individual was in critical condition and required immediate medical rescue. Medical personnel responded rapidly, dispatching an ambulance to the bridge within minutes, and the EMT crew had to assist the man onto the gurney because he no longer had the strength to balance himself. At the nearest medical facility, emergency evaluation was conducted, including vital signs assessment, rapid tests, and documentation of severe dehydration, profound nutrient deficiency, long-term muscle atrophy, and multiple partially healed wounds that showed signs of repeated, ongoing trauma rather than random injury. When hospital staff tried to ask for his name, the patient only repeated a few incomplete phrases, his gaze vacant, as though he did not understand whether he had just been rescued or was still trapped in the same environment his body had endured for so long. During patient intake, local police arrived to file a report because the man carried no identification, and his inability to communicate normally required them to use biometric identification methods. When the fingerprint data was entered into the federal system, the result came back almost instantly. The identity matched completely with the record of Max Carter, the individual documented as missing in Yosemite 2 years earlier, and classified as a cold case under NPS standards. This confirmation sent a major shock through the local law enforcement personnel because Max's physical condition did not fit any known model of wilderness survival over 2 full years without a stable food source or fixed shelter. The degree of musculoskeletal damage, dehydration ratio, extent of muscle atrophy, and the deep impressions around his wrists indicated prolonged captivity rather than independent survival in a natural environment. As soon as identity was confirmed, Max's cold case file was automatically reopened in the federal system and shifted to special investigation status because the reappearance of a person missing under circumstances with no prior clues, more than 30 miles of rugged forest from the point of disappearance, yet showing no signs of survival consistent with being lost, meant the entire case could no longer be treated as an outdoor incident. The initial medical report sent to investigators confirmed that the extent of Max's injuries was incompatible with any natural accident, especially the ligature marks on his wrists, and the extreme callousing of skin on his hands indicators, commonly seen in cases of forced labor or prolonged restricted movement in confined spaces. The investigation team noted that Max's body displayed signs of an extended captivity cycle, including repetitive abrasions on his shins, friction ulcers around his ankles, areas of skin discoloration from lack of light exposure, and several patches of abnormally thickened skin from long-term rubbing against hard surfaces. All of these findings made Max's return a pivotal turning point, forcing park authorities and law enforcement to shift the case from a survival search to consideration of organized criminal involvement. His appearance in a state suggesting recent escape from prolonged controlled confinement completely changed the approach to the file, and the fact that he reappeared at a location far from the disappearance site, without the acute disorientation typically seen in people who have wandered lost in the woods, gave the captivity hypothesis a high degree of credibility. The discovery of Max in such condition meant the case could no longer be regarded as a natural environment missing person incident. It was classified as an event containing multiple anomalous factors requiring criminal investigation under federal emergency protocols. As soon as Max's body had its initial vital signs stabilized at the medical facility, the team of doctors conducted a comprehensive evaluation to determine the extent of the damage, as well as the nature of the abnormal signs appearing on his skin, muscles, and bones. The initial observations quickly formed a very clear clinical picture of prolonged severe emaciation, shown through a body weight dozens of percentage points below normal, drastically reduced muscle tone, near total disappearance of subcutaneous fat, and micronutrient tests, revealing vitamin D levels at an extremely low point, an indicator that only appears when the body has lived in a light-deprived environment for an extended period. This led the doctors to completely rule out the possibility that Max survived by moving through the forest or taking spontaneous shelter in the open wilderness, because even people lost for long periods in the woods still receive regular sunlight unless confined in an enclosed space. On Max's skin surface were numerous repetitive pattern injuries. Thin, healed scratch scars interspersed with dark bruises in various stages of recovery, proving these traumas did not result from a single fall or any specific accident, but were the outcome of repeated mechanical impacts occurring in cycles, especially on both forearms and lower legs. The ligature marks on his wrists left long, sharply defined, deeply indented grooves consistent with hard material or binding cord used over a prolonged time. And these grooves were not only horizontal but included multiple diagonal streaks, indicating moments when the binding had been pulled tight from different angles. Around the ankles appeared areas of hardened, discolored skin typical of intense and prolonged friction, along with several deep skin fissures, leading the medical team to conclude that these were not injuries caused by natural abrasion or long-distance hiking, but rather signs of feet and ankles having been restrained with crude but continuously applied devices. Examination of the shoulder and back musculature revealed abnormally thickened and tense muscle bands in the upper shoulder region and along both sides of the scapulae, while the lower back muscles showed accumulated micro-tears, indicators that Max had been forced to perform heavy labor or repeat high-force movements at high frequency over a long period. The distribution pattern of these injuries did not match any wilderness survival model, because a lost person would not produce such regular, cyclical, and muscle group-specific chains of trauma. Instead, it closely resembled the pattern seen in bodies compelled to carry, drag, or lift heavy objects within a confined space. Evaluation of the spine showed no curvature or misalignment typical of severe falls or impacts against rocky slopes, and the ribs displayed no point of impact slippage, a feature commonly found in people who have fallen from height or been struck by rolling rocks. The doctors found no evidence whatsoever of wilderness accident indicators, such as acute fractures, widespread bruising from arc force impacts, long scratches following the direction of body movement, or plant fragments deeply embedded in the epidermis. The exclusion of a natural outdoor accident became definitive when surface skin analysis samples contained no pollen, tree resin, or insect fragments corresponding to the Yosemite forest environment, indicating Max had not been living in continuous contact with forest vegetation. Blood tests and biochemical analysis measuring serum protein levels, iron content, blood glucose, and ketone cycles revealed that the body had undergone prolonged, cyclical malnutrition, consistent with being provided a minimal, controlled amount of food, rather than experiencing sudden starvation, like someone lost for days who actively forages for natural food sources. The ratio of trace minerals and signs of chronic dehydration also aligned with a model of deliberately restricted water access, because Max's body showed no evidence of having drunk from natural sources containing the bacteria or characteristic minerals found in Yosemite streams. All medical data recorded in the first 48 hours converged on the conclusion that Max had lived in a severely confined environment with minimal light exposure, severely restricted free movement, repeated mechanical stress applied to the same muscle groups, and controlled forced regulation of both nutrition and water intake. These findings strongly reinforced the suspicion that Max had endured a systematic, prolonged captivity long enough to produce clear structural changes in muscle tissue, skin, and metabolic markers, a condition impossible to develop if he had simply been lost or independently surviving in the natural environment. When the team of psychological specialists began assessing Max's mental state, the first thing they noted was an especially pronounced startle response whenever he heard the sound of hard-soled shoes coming from the hospital hallway. An entirely normal sound to others, but one that made him flinch so violently, jerk sideways on the hospital bed, exhibiting behavior typical of someone who had been conditioned by the sound of authoritative, commanding footsteps. At the same time, every time the silhouette of a physically imposing man passed by the door, Max's body instinctively contracted. His shoulders rose as if to shield his neck, and his hands unconsciously drew closer to his torso, assuming the defensive posture of someone who had spent a long time under close, absolute supervision by a figure of total authority. This state indicated that Max had developed avoidance reflexes toward stimuli associated with military personnel, particularly when gait, stride rhythm, or weight distribution triggered memories of threat, and these reactions occurred even when he was not consciously aware of who the person in front of him was. When asked about time, Max was unable to determine how long he had been missing. He estimated that only a small portion of time had been lost, a few weeks or, at most, a few months, while doctors had already confirmed he had been missing for nearly 2 years. This discrepancy reflected a severe disturbance in time perception, a condition commonly seen in victims forced to live in enclosed environments without stable day-night cycles, causing the sense of elapsed time to be compressed or elongated, depending on the degree of control exerted by the captor. Max answered questions in a disjointed rhythm, sometimes pausing mid-sentence as though waiting for an invisible signal granting permission to continue speaking, a pattern regarded as a clear sign of the command-compliance dynamic, showing he had lived for a prolonged period in a system where decision-making was stripped away and personal behavior was shaped by waiting for approval from the authority figure. The doctors observed that Max had a tendency to seek permission before performing even minor actions such as drinking water, standing up, or shifting position even though no one required it. This response is frequently seen in individuals who have undergone systematic behavioral control, where every movement had to be cleared by the person enforcing the rules. Throughout the evaluation, Max displayed signs consistent with a distorted form of psychological attachment, commonly referred to as trauma bonding, which develops when a victim is held in harsh conditions, interspersed with moments of reduced pressure, creating a cycle of tension and relief that makes it difficult for the captive to distinguish between coercive power and the dependence that keeps them compliant to avoid punishment. In many moments, Max appeared confused when asked about personal agency. He hesitated for a long time before answering simple questions such as, "What would you like to drink?" or "Do you want to rest?" as though the process of making individual choices had been disabled for a long enough period that he no longer believed he had the right to decide. Whenever a specialist reminded him that he could say anything he wanted, Max tended to look down at the floor, clench his hands together, and breathe rapidly as if the freedom to speak was itself linked to a sense of danger. In that context, the expert team concluded that Max could not provide a statement immediately because his memories were fragmented into disconnected pieces, impossible to retrieve in sequence, and any attempt to force recall would trigger intense stress responses that would lock the memories down even more tightly. They documented that Max frequently repeated certain unconscious movements, lightly tapping his fingers in a steady rhythm, touching the old indentations on his wrists, or shifting his body weight in the manner of moving within a confined space, habits that reflected a severely restricted living environment. When examining body language, the doctors noticed that Max often glanced toward the doorway whenever he heard a loud noise, his eyes opening excessively wide, neck slightly retracting, in a state of hyper-alertness resembling someone who had long awaited the appearance of a figure exerting pressure over him. These signs not only fit, but precisely matched the psychological profile of victims who have endured prolonged captivity, where core perceptions of freedom, control, and safety are profoundly altered, causing them to maintain defensive responses even after escaping the threatening environment. From the full range of psychological presentation, the doctors concluded that Max had lived long enough under absolute control mechanisms to blur the boundary between personal choice and submission. A classic hallmark of someone subjected to systematic psychological manipulation and forced to adapt to a captive environment, by complying with every rule in order to avoid harm. The psychological and medical evaluations clearly established that Max could not have survived independently in the wilderness for such an extended period, which prompted the investigating agencies to activate a joint protocol between the FBI and the NPS Investigative Services Branch, ISB, to re-examine the entire cold case file based on the new evidence carried in Max's body and behavior. The investigation team quickly revisited old documents to identify anomalies that had previously been overlooked or deemed insignificant. During the case file review, FBI specialists analyzed certain pieces of information recorded during the initial search phase, particularly details concerning inaccessible areas, locations drones could not scan, and side paths branching off mist trail to determine whether those zones aligned with the type of confined captivity described by the medical findings. The analysis team reached a consensus that, given Max's physical condition, survival in the wild was impossible, and that there must have been one or more individuals capable of maintaining long-term control over his daily activities, nutrition, and light exposure. They therefore concluded that human involvement was not merely possible but necessary. With this premise, the FBI and NPS-ISB initiated a comprehensive re-interview and re-verification process of every witness who had seen Max on the day he disappeared, including those already documented in reports, individuals captured on peripheral parking lot cameras, and any hikers who might have been on the same route but left the area before search teams arrived. The witness review focused on two key elements: the exact timing of the last confirmed sighting of Max, and any unusual behavior or presence of a man with a military-like build appearing near Max during the late afternoon. The investigation team scrutinized statements for matching details, physical description, clothing, standing position, duration of contact, in order to determine whether witnesses had inadvertently observed someone potentially connected to the abduction. Simultaneously, the technical team began extracting Max's electronic device history by pulling data from cellular providers, tower ping records, and any cached GPS logs stored in the system before the phone went completely silent. Technicians confirmed that the final timestamp of Max's phone transmitting a signal aligned almost precisely with the window during which a witness reported seeing Max standing near an unknown man close to the Nevada Fall overlook, with a discrepancy of only a few minutes, making this a critical anchor point for establishing where Max was likely approached or taken under control. After integrating the new data with Max's psychological reactions when shown terrain maps, the investigation team identified 3 priority areas for re-examination based on the fragmented, incomplete descriptions Max provided about certain sounds, echo quality, ground texture, and spatial sensations. These 3 areas included the dense forest above the Mist Trail route, a little-known connector trail leading toward Alder Creek, and a narrow flat section near Old Glacier Point Road. Each location was selected because of the strong correspondence between Max's described sensations and the actual terrain characteristics, such as thick canopy, severely limiting light, short echoing footsteps on hard-packed ground, or enclosed spatial structures capable of producing low-frequency reverberation. By combining old SAR data with Max's disjointed memory fragments and witness statements, the investigation team constructed a new timeline reconstructing Max's movements on the day he vanished. The moment he left the parking lot, his observed positions along Mist Trail, the last confirmed sighting area, the exact time the phone ceased activity, and the subsequent data void. This new timeline no longer served a survival search purpose but instead aimed to measure the degree of overlap between the appearance of the military-postured man and Max's sudden, unexplained disappearance, while assessing the likelihood that Max had been led off onto a side path or subdued at a location where few visitors were present in the late afternoon. The convergence of timing, location, and Max's condition transformed this timeline into the foundation for reorganizing the investigative strategy around manpower, terrain, witnesses, and device data, forming the first outline of a criminal rather than natural environment approach, consistent with the nature of the medical and psychological evidence already documented. When the investigators began the first interview session with Max in a specially designated victim interview room, no handcuffs, no barriers, and only soft lighting to avoid triggering stress responses, Max spent many minutes simply trying to stabilize his breathing, before he could manage his first sentence. What he described right from the start immediately drew strong attention from the investigation team. He referred to a man with a very distinctive, military-like bearing, straight back, broad shoulders, firm and deliberate footsteps, and a quick head-turn style typical of someone accustomed to constantly scanning the surroundings. But the man's face remained beyond Max's ability to reconstruct, even when he tried hard to visualize it, a common trait in victims of prolonged control where memories of the perpetrator are obscured by chronic stress. When asked for more detail about the voice, Max described a hard, clipped tone that pronounced each syllable distinctly, as though issuing commands, lacking any normal conversational inflection, and exactly resembling the way a military drill instructor speaks to recruits during training. This caused him to have a reflexive shrinking response whenever he heard deep, resonant, or rhythmically steady sounds. He described sounds he had heard during the period of control: the thud of boots on hard ground, metallic objects clinking together, the click of locks opening, and the heavy, labored breathing of someone accustomed to carrying heavy loads, all forming an inseparable auditory chain tied to the image of that man. When the investigator shifted the questions to memories of movement, Max offered many fragmented pieces of recall, not in chronological order, but all related to being forced to walk through the forest at night, when visibility dropped sharply and the ground was so cold that sensation under the soles of his feet seemed to disappear. He remembered flickering light from a handheld device, possibly a small flashlight, creating a narrow, gently shaking beam that followed the rhythm of footsteps, making tree shadows stretch and contract continuously, and producing the sensation of moving through an endless forest. He also mentioned a damp, cold smell mixed with rotting wood and occasionally a metallic odor, which investigators noted as a possible indication that he had been led through an area containing man-made materials or a holding structure. Certain memory fragments involved the sound of wind whistling through narrow rock crevices and the drip of water onto a hard surface, helping to narrow the range of relevant terrain. During the interview, investigators asked Max to try describing more specific elements to aid identification: the thickness of the canopy when looking up, the quality of light filtering through gaps, the feel of the ground underfoot, soft, dry, damp, or jagged rock, and even the scent carried by the wind that he remembered. Max's focus gradually sharpened as he closed his eyes and attempted to reconstruct those spatial fragments. When he described a dry, sandy, earthy wind smell, dim light consistent with low canopy forest, and very short sound reverberation, as though the surrounding space absorbed noise rather than reflecting it, the investigators immediately cross-referenced this with terrain data previously collected by SAR. The noteworthy point was that Max's descriptions matched several characteristics of areas where drones had encountered scanning obstacles: thick tree cover, dry soil mixed with fine dust, and sound that dissipated quickly due to dense vegetation. This convergence created the first tangible field lead, guiding the strategy toward identifying potential locations. When investigators presented area maps and asked Max to point to any region that felt familiar, even if the memories were incomplete, Max appeared confused, but still placed his hand on zones with dense forest, small trails branching off the main route, and terrain matching the sensations he had described. These selections aligned precisely with the 3 priority areas previously established. At the conclusion of the first interview session, the investigation team agreed that although the information Max provided was fragmented, it carried high directional value because the alignment between his account and certain real-world terrain descriptions showed he was retrieving genuine memories rather than imagining details. However, the degree of fragmentation, his inability to reconstruct the man's face, and the fact that memories were jumbled more by sensory impression than by timeline, led the specialist to conclude that Max was not yet capable of providing full identification or a specific route description. The investigation team determined that this preliminary interview served only as an initial step for filtering and gathering sensory markers, and that progressing toward identifying the perpetrator or the confinement structure would require a more stable memory recovery process for Max, rather than one driven by intense questioning that could trigger strong activation. The fragmented sensory descriptions that Max provided during the interview process led the investigation team to focus on 3 specific areas of Yosemite that matched the level of light, sound, and ground surface he mentioned, including Alder Creek, Deep Creek, and the long closed section of Old Glacier Point Road, where the tree canopy is extremely dense, the soil is dry, mixed with fine dust, and the terrain structure slopes rapidly into narrow depressions. The narrowing process was based on overlaying map data, memory fragments that Max described in terms of smells, footstep echo quality, and the sensation of being surrounded by confined space, combined with SAR reports archived from the initial search phase. The Alder Creek area was prioritized first because the vegetation density was sufficient to create the short sound effects and limited light as Max described, and the ground survey team quickly advanced into the zone, using positioning equipment to identify areas that had been altered by human intervention. While surveying the forest pockets between Alder Creek and the southern slopes, the team discovered a patch of ground flatter than the surrounding terrain, showing signs of having been evenly compacted in a rectangular shape, along with fragments of rotted fabric, broken nylon cord, and scattered wooden frame pieces, all suggesting that a lightweight temporary shelter had once stood there. The remaining wood fragments showed surfaces abraded in the same direction over a long period, accompanied by dark stains along the edges that suggested repeated contact with hands or hard objects, and the survey team immediately collected samples for analysis. When examining the structure of the temporary shelter through the remnants left on the ground, the specialist group used material aging techniques based on organic decomposition levels and wood surface wear patterns, indicating that this structure had been used not just for a few nights, but long enough to create stable indentations in the underlying soil layer. This degree of compaction could not have formed if it were merely a short rest spot for an undistant, ordinary hiker. Outside the shelter foundation area, the survey team encountered multiple long drag marks on the ground, as though heavy objects had been moved repeatedly along a fixed direction. These marks had uneven depths, indicating moments when objects were dragged over wet soil, and when the soil had dried, implying repeated behavior over days or weeks. In addition, some patches of ground showed light disturbance, not deep enough for full digging pits, but sufficient to prove surface probing or trace cleaning activity. The semicircular soil push marks to the sides led the survey team to flag this as a point for behavioral analysis mapping. When data from the Alder Creek area was brought back to the command center, the specialist team immediately reconstructed the location diagram based on Max's vague descriptions, including the sensation of light being almost completely blocked, the smell of dry earth mixed with rotting wood, sounds that did not carry far, and the feeling of being enclosed by solid surfaces. Based on analysis models, the investigation team built a 3-layer map: the terrain layer, describing canopy density, rock surfaces, slope; the trace layer, including the shelter foundation, drag marks, and abrasion signs; and the sensory layer, pieced from Max's words on light, smells, and types of noise. When the 3 layers were overlaid, the experts noted significant correspondence between the elements Max described and the actual shelter foundation area, making this location the most critical point of suspicion among the 3 narrowed zones. The presence of the temporary shelter foundation, heavy object drag marks, and surface abrasion signs allowed the investigation team to hypothesize that this area may have been used for securing a victim or creating an organized living space, and with the possibility of subsurface structures in the adjacent area, the team directed the issuance of a decision to expand the survey scope to the underlying soil layer. The digging decision was based on analysis that temporary shelters are often built over or next to other structures to conceal subsurface activity, and Max's memory of confined space with very short reverberation reinforced the hypothesis of an underground pit or chamber. The area around the shelter foundation was marked using metal detectors, geophysical scanners, and long soil probes to identify differences in soil density. Preliminary results showed a band of unusually compacted soil extending in a much larger rectangular shape than the shelter foundation traces, forming a suspicious zone requiring excavation within the approved scope. Because the ground surface had a fairly thick layer of decayed leaves, specialists had to remove it in small sections to avoid damaging underlying traces, and the digging plan was implemented based on the objective of determining whether any subsurface structure existed that matched what Max described in his fragmented memory pieces. All collected data was entered into the file as the first chain of information bearing direct signs related to human presence in the suspicious area, creating the foundation for deeper survey directions by the investigation team. When the excavation uncovered a rectangular depression sunk deep beneath the unusually compacted soil layer, the investigation team directed bright lights straight down into the area and discovered an underground structure not large, but sufficiently enclosed to dampen sound and block light almost completely. Right at the bottom surface, where the soil had been cleared away, lay several partially cut nylon cords, some still forming intact loops, others frayed at the ends, all matching in size and tension pattern the deep indentations found on Max's wrists and ankles. The specialist team tested the cord's elasticity and observed clear, repeated pressure marks, indicating the material had endured significant, recurring force. A crucial detail proving this location had been used to restrain a human body for a considerable period. Near the cords, the survey team collected a series of items scattered in the dry dust. Old MRE food box casings with production codes from military-issue rations manufactured over many years, some still bearing faint printed labels and lot numbers, consistent with the type of MREs commonly carried by former military personnel during training or field exercises. These boxes hold no practical value for typical hikers, due to their heavy metal construction and dense, hard-to-digest rations, yet they are perfectly suited for long-term, controlled resupply to someone with military habits. MREs typically leave distinctive opening marks on the lid and tear edge, and the technical team noted straight, decisive rips, indicating a user accustomed to opening these rations with disciplined, practiced motions. On a flat wooden plank pressed against the earthen wall, the investigation team found a thick board whose surface showed arc-shaped abrasion patterns, each arc deepest at the center, consistent with the wear caused by rope or nylon cord, repeatedly pulled taut over a fixed anchor point, and the surface also displayed numerous parallel horizontal scratches, matching continuous tightening or binding with strong hand force. These marks do not result from ordinary camping activity, as hiker tabletops are generally used for cooking or placing items, whereas this surface showed heavy, focused impact from cord or metal implements. Close to the wooden surface, the team recovered a small, rigid metal hook fragment with a uniform curve, thickly coated in soil dust, identified as part of an improvised tie-down clip used to secure cordage. As the entire underground chamber was surveyed, clear signs of prolonged habitation emerged. A fine layer of light gray ash concentrated in one corner, indicating a fire kept deliberately small to minimize smoke. Partially burned wood scraps and stones arranged in a small ring forming a rudimentary but repeatedly used hearth, as judged by the volume of accumulated ash. The ash was stratified, with distinct layers separated by thin soil, showing fire use occurred in cycles, and that the user made efforts to conceal it by scattering dirt over the ashes after each session. In another corner, the ground featured a shallow body-shaped depression, as though someone had sat or lain there for extended periods. The depression was deep enough to indicate repeated, long-term presence rather than brief use. Around the depression appeared small brown and gray fabric threads, likely shed from old clothing under high friction or poor hygiene conditions. The forensic team collected additional evidence within the permitted scope, including loose hair fragments, shed skin cells, and soil-adhered fabric fibers, all placed into sealed evidence bags for laboratory submission. While examining the earthen walls, technicians discovered multiple horizontal scrape marks running close to the ground, not deep, but regular in pattern, appearing as traces left when heavy objects or cords were dragged across the hard surface. Another corner showed a small circular indentation, the size of a fist, possibly the spot where a post or wooden stake had been driven to anchor restraints. Floodlights revealed straight lines of compacted soil extending from the surface shelter foundation down into the underground chamber, confirming a direct connection between the upper temporary shelter and the subsurface structure below, reinforcing the assessment that this site was used as a deliberate holding point rather than a random refuge. While gathering evidence, The specialist team used specialized tools to collect DNA samples from the nylon cords, wooden surfaces, MRE box openings, and even the ash, since ash can sometimes preserve partially charred cellular material. Each sample was divided into two portions, one for rapid analysis, the other for long-term storage. The technical team visually identified several hairs adhering to wood crevices and skin cells caught in the frayed cord sections. These were placed into sterile tubes, assigned unique case numbers, and entered into the cold storage chain of custody. All evidence recovered from the underground shelter was cataloged by sample code, with precise documentation of discovery location, orientation, depth, and material condition. The items were then transported to the forensic laboratory for DNA analysis to identify the source of the samples and evaluate their connection to Max's body or to any individual who had been present within the structure. When the evidence collected from the underground shelter area at Alder Creek was transferred to the forensic laboratory, the DNA sample taken from the nylon cord found in the subsurface structure quickly produced an unexpected result. The nucleotide sequence matched exactly with the biometric record of Ethan Cole, a former military serviceman who had once resided in the same neighborhood as Max's family, and this record was already in the federal database because Ethan had served in the infantry before being discharged with a special medical evaluation. The match was not partial similarity but a complete identification profile, allowing the investigation team to rule out any possibility of mix-up or environmental DNA transfer, as the nylon cord contained a sufficiently high concentration of epithelial cells to conclude that the person who left it must have had direct, prolonged contact with the cord during use, rather than incidental touch. When Ethan's data was pulled, the investigation team promptly cross-checked rental cabin history near Yosemite that required identity verification through document checking services, and the record showed Ethan had checked in at a location near Bass Lake just 3 days before Max disappeared. A short driving distance to Mist Trail, and entirely consistent with entering the park without leaving traces in the visitor registration system. In addition to the cabin data, Ethan's credit records revealed a fuel purchase at a gas station near the southern Yosemite entrance on the exact day Max set out on his hike, and security camera footage there captured a man whose body size, gait, and weight distribution matched the description given by the witness who last saw Max on Mist Trail. Together, this information formed a strong chain of evidence showing that Ethan was not only present in the area at the precise time, but also exhibited movement patterns aligning with Max's last recorded position. When the investigation team expanded the financial review, they found an invoice for a full-week cabin rental that coincided exactly with Max's planned trekking schedule. The cabin was in a sparsely populated area with little traffic and close to secondary trails leading into dense forest zones away from main tourist routes, providing ideal conditions for covert movement without detection. Ethan's military record showed he had left the armed forces with a severe PTSD diagnosis, including numerous notes describing episodes of agitation triggered by the sound of boots or loud voices, along with documented instances of barracks rule violations involving violence. After returning to civilian life, Ethan had been reported for several neighborhood conflicts involving shouting arguments, property destruction, and intimidating behavior toward others when he felt disrespected, and local police files contained multiple incident reports of altercations with neighbors, including one directly involving Max. This chain of data created a plausible motive profile, a long-simmering personal conflict between Max and Ethan, originating from Ethan's irritation with Max's occasional mocking attitude toward military personnel during real-life encounters, and exacerbated by PTSD that caused Ethan to interpret ordinary remarks as attacks on his honor, thereby forming a motive for retaliation. Furthermore, the fact that Ethan left the neighborhood immediately before Max departed for his hiking trip and chose Yosemite, a vast enough area to conceal unusual activity, further clarified the likelihood that Ethan had deliberately tracked Max and selected the most opportune moment to gain control. The investigation team compared the traces found in the underground shelter with Ethan's military training record and noted that the arrangement of items, the marking style on Yosemite terrain maps, and the use of MREs aligned with the habits of someone who had participated in highly disciplined field exercises. The terrain map recovered from the shelter featured short, straight hatch marks, layered in the pattern used by military personnel to designate observation lines or shortcut routes, matching skills Ethan had been trained in. The abrasion patterns on the wooden board were also consistent with the technique of tensioning cord to secure objects or human bodies, using temporary restraint methods applied in military training simulations. The convergence of layout style, military-grade items, DNA presence, and location of appearance led the investigation team to conclude that Ethan had not only been present at Yosemite, but had used the underground structure to carry out prolonged human confinement with a high degree of control. The presence of Ethan's DNA on key evidence eliminated all other hypotheses, and the supporting data cabin rental, fuel transaction, camera footage, and history of personal conflict formed a seamless chain of proof, strong enough to positively identify a suspect. When all elements were entered into the case file, the responsible team officially designated Ethan Cole as the primary suspect in the abduction and prolonged detention related to Max, and the file was updated in the system as a criminal case with a positively identified subject and a high degree of consistency between physical evidence and documented behavior. When the investigating agency began a deep analysis of the reasons that enabled Ethan Cole to carry out the prolonged confinement of Max, documents related to his residential history and social interactions revealed a distinctive psychological trait: extreme irritation triggered by any remarks insulting the military or any behavior he perceived as showing disrespect toward the armed forces. Numerous neighbors had stated in civil incident reports that Ethan experienced emotional outbursts whenever someone joked about the military or criticized principles of discipline, and in some cases these episodes of agitation led to him smashing objects or loudly threatening those around him. These records became significant when investigators gathered information concerning the relationship between Max and Ethan in their former neighborhood. A series of statements indicated that the two had a history of intense conflict, originating from Max's habit of making mocking comments about military life, sometimes half jokingly, half seriously, in ways that made Ethan feel personally insulted. Some neighbors described Ethan standing silently, trying to control his breathing whenever Max said things like, "You act like you're still in the barracks," or "Stop ordering people around," and these reactions were viewed as signs of suppressed emotion. Ethan's medical records from the time of his discharge noted severe PTSD, with a tendency to interpret social situations through a lens of threat or dishonor, causing him to readily perceive others' words as personal attacks. The severity of the PTSD, combined with mild hallucinations and rigid thinking patterns, created conditions conducive to a punish to teach a lesson response pattern, meaning Ethan believed that anyone who insulted values he held dear needed to be corrected through a form of coercive behavior modeled on military training. When investigators cross-referenced the timing of Ethan's departure from his hometown with Max's hiking trip, they noticed that Ethan left the neighborhood on the exact day Max headed to Yosemite, an unusual coincidence because Ethan had no prior history of participating in hiking or outdoor recreational activities. His credit card records, fuel transactions, and the location of the cabin he rented showed that he did not travel to Yosemite for leisure, but for a deliberate mission to track Max. Analysis of Ethan's behavior leading up to Max's disappearance revealed a clear pattern of escalation. Long-standing personal conflict, Ethan's pathological sensitivity to Max's remarks, and Ethan's perception that Max did not respect his military past. Criminal psychologists reviewed the chain of facts and concluded that Ethan's underlying motive was not to abduct someone to evade criminal responsibility or gain material benefit, but rather to force Max to undergo a form of mandatory training, mimicking what recruits endure in a military environment, yet distorted into a personal control scenario where Ethan assumed the role of absolute authority and Max was compelled to comply. Medical findings regarding Max's physical injuries, ligature marks, shoulder and back trauma, and severe light deprivation showed that he had been forced to perform monotonous, repetitive, and coercive tasks, which precisely aligned with Ethan's psychological logic that punishment was the only way for Max to understand that disrespectful words carried a price. Investigators defined the criminal motive as an equation of two elements: Max's perceived arrogance in communication, which Ethan experienced as a serious insult, and PTSD, which prevented Ethan from interpreting the situation calmly and instead drove him toward extreme behavior. When combined, these two factors activated a sequence of personally vengeful actions in which Ethan viewed the abduction and control of Max as a reasonable means to re-establish order according to his warped standards. When the investigating agency compiled all data regarding Ethan's history of agitation, the conflicts that had occurred between the two men, his prolonged PTSD condition, the fact that he left town on the same day Max traveled to Yosemite, and his presence in the area without any legitimate or precedent recreational reason, all these elements converged into a solid foundation, proving that the criminal behavior was not impulsive, but the outcome of a motive that had developed over time. The final analysis report clearly described the intersection of pathological, psychological factors, and social conflict factors, resulting in a complete motive, capable of leading to abduction, confinement, and prolonged control. Evidence obtained from medical examinations, DNA, and spatial positioning reinforced the conclusion that Ethan committed the crime driven by a personal motivation stemming directly from the negative interactions between him and Max in everyday life. In the interview session conducted once Max's health had stabilized enough to begin recovering his earliest memories, he started describing the moment he encountered Ethan on Mist Trail, where the late-day light filtered through narrow tree canopies, creating dappled shadow patches, and right at the small uphill section near the curve overlooking the white rushing water, the confrontation between the two escalated quickly as Ethan positioned himself to partially block the path, his cold gaze and military-style foot placement making Max uncomfortable, leading to a few sarcastic remarks about Ethan bringing the whole barracks into the forest, which caused Ethan's face to pale and prompted him to take a short step toward Max. That brief exchange did not result in an immediate physical altercation, but created a sense of being followed when Max moved away from that spot and continued upward toward the falls. At every section of the trail, he felt someone maintaining distance behind him, heavy and perfectly regular footsteps exactly like the movement of someone trained in disciplined marching. When investigators asked for clearer details, Max said he never saw Ethan's face throughout the subsequent period because the man always kept enough distance to stay out of direct line of sight, yet each measured step made Max recognize that the presence was not coincidental. As Mist Trail grew quieter with many visitors heading back down, Ethan began closing the gap, choosing the moment when Max turned onto a small side trail to the right one with thick foliage, rarely used, and completely shielded from the main route. Max did not think much of turning onto that side path because he wanted to take a few photos in the softer light. But the very close rustling of leaves behind him made him turn his head, and that was the first moment he clearly saw Ethan's figure closing in. Max could not clearly recall what Ethan said, because only a moment later, he felt a powerful impact from behind his head that made everything go black, his hearing fading, as though a door had slammed shut. When he first regained consciousness in a hazy state, Max felt his body being dragged along the ground, his hands pulled tightly behind him, wrists burning from nylon cord rubbing against skin, and his eyes covered with fabric that plunged him into absolute darkness. The only sound he heard was Ethan's boots, striking dry ground, steady, deliberate thuds like those in a marching drill, each step carrying indescribable terror. Max described complete disorientation, because he could no longer sense slope or wind direction. Sometimes cold wind blew across his face, indicating they were crossing an open area. Then the temperature immediately shifted warmer, as though entering dense forest with low canopy, where the air seemed to stand still. His body was dragged in a half-conscious, half-unconscious state, and every time the binding cord was pulled taut, sharp pain shot through his shoulders so that he could only stumble forward without resistance. He recounted that he repeatedly tried to track how long he was being moved, but had no light-dark markers to gauge time because his eyes were completely covered, narrowing all his senses to the sound of hard-soled boots, heavy breathing, and the faint clinking of gear sounds that vividly evoked a military environment, yet placed within a forest setting, turning them into a source of profound dread. When investigators asked about the moment he was first brought into the underground shelter, Max tried to connect the fragmented pieces of memory, He remembered his body being pushed down a gentle slope, the ground changing to a looser feel with the smell of old earth and rotting wood. A hard material, perhaps a hinge or wooden latch, made a loud scraping sound very close by. Then his body was shoved downward onto deeper steps that caused impact to his legs and hips. The air below was thick and highly humid, with extremely short sound reverberation, indicating a confined space surrounded by thick soil. He described Ethan gripping the binding cord and pulling him deeper into that space, forcing him to sit in a small depression on the cold ground. In the memory, Max still registered the low, heavy voice, pronounced in a commanding style, not shouting, but sharp as a blade, and every time Ethan spoke with finality, Max felt compelled to stay silent. In that moment, Max realized he had been completely severed from the outside world, and the only presence left was darkness, his own breathing, and Ethan's movements. He recounted that from the time he was first brought into the underground shelter, the concept of time disappeared. No more day-night cycle, only intervals of sound, shifts in temperature, and the oppressive weight of the cord tightening around his wrists. Investigators noted that Max's account of the abduction process, from the initial encounter on Mist Trail, being followed onto the small side trail, the blow that caused unconsciousness, being bound and dragged through forest terrain at night, to the moment of being taken into the subsurface space, aligned precisely with all the physical evidence and structures discovered at the suspect location, thereby confirming that Max's recovered memories accurately reconstructed the opening sequence of events that led to the prolonged captivity period. Max described that right from the moment he realized he was underground, in a confined space where heavy dampness clung to his skin, he clearly sensed how Ethan established control in those first hours through a low, hard voice and disciplined movements that turned every step into something more like a command than normal behavior. Ethan didn't need to shout, but every sentence had the structure of an order, making Max understand that disobedience would lead to consequences he couldn't predict. Ethan demanded that Max hold a fixed sitting position, hands tied and pulled behind him, while Ethan paced the cramped space as though observing his reactions. Max said fear choked his breathing because even the slightest movement caused the nylon cord to tighten painfully. The first days in the underground shelter followed a pattern Max described as forced training protocol, consisting of heavy tasks such as moving wooden materials, clearing rocks, digging the soil base, and arranging items exactly where Ethan designated. Everything had to be done in silence, under the weak beam of a flashlight that Ethan controlled. Max said he didn't understand why Ethan imposed such tasks, but when he accidentally mismatched speed or placement, Ethan stood close behind him, voice level and cold. Do it again. Correctly. Those tasks weren't free labor. They resembled physical drills in a military environment, where recruits are forced to follow sequences of actions without asking questions. On the rare occasions Ethan offered any explanation, he said this was a lesson in respect, that Max needed to understand how offensive his remarks about military personnel had been, and that only by enduring harsh discipline would he grasp the value of what he had mocked. Max remembered Ethan's words spoken in the darkness, low and calm, that arrogance needs correction, turning the underground space into an inescapable interrogation room. Ethan maintained a sensory management pattern that Max described as separation from the world, with complete isolation from natural light. The shelter had only a few tiny gaps insufficient to distinguish day from night, and Ethan controlled the flashlight beam at will, stripping Max of any ability to track time. External sounds were completely blocked, and for long stretches, Max's entire world consisted of his own breathing, the sound of nylon cord rubbing against skin, and the thud of Ethan's hard-soled boots hitting the ground whenever he entered. Over time, Max lost count of how many sleep-wake cycles passed because he was awakened unpredictably. Sometimes Ethan struck the ground with a hard object, sending a sharp sound through the confined space that jolted Max awake without any sense of how long he had slept. As the tests repeated in the same relentless pattern, Max began slipping into a state of dependence, because every minor error, placing a piece of wood in the wrong spot, or failing to maintain the required silence, led to punishment. Tighter cord binding, forced standing in exhausting postures, or water withheld for hours. Through his account, Max explained that Ethan didn't only apply physical measures, but also constructed a unilateral order in which Max had to ask permission before any movement, even shifting his hands or turning his body. Every time he forgot this rule, Ethan commanded in clipped tones, "Stop. No unauthorized movement." The constant repetition of these rules, combined with total control over every activity, gradually eroded Max's sense of self, leading to the state he described as existing only to comply. Ethan restricted food to minimal levels, usually half an MRE portion, or water doled out in tiny sips, causing Max's strength to decline yet remain just sufficient for the required labor. Meals did not occur on any fixed schedule but depended entirely on Ethan's mood, creating constant uncertainty that kept Max's body and mind in perpetual alertness. Rest was strictly limited. Max was allowed to lie down only when Ethan permitted, and had to rise immediately at the sound of boots striking the ground, regardless of whether he had been lying for minutes or hours. His sleeping area was nothing more than a small depression in the cold dirt floor, with no mat or covering, causing constant pain in his back and shoulders. Max's movement was restricted by cords tied at lengths that prevented him from standing fully upright or taking more than 2 steps, keeping his body under continuous mechanical stress. Max described the feeling that every element of life, food, water, light, sleep, and movement, no longer belonged to him, but was entirely regulated by Ethan. In that space, every action Ethan took was deliberately aimed at dismantling Max's capacity for independent decision-making, and the repeated alternation of punishment with tests pulled Max into a cycle where fear of punishment blended with the desire to perform correctly to avoid Ethan's anger, gradually forming a psychological dependence that Max could not recognize while it was happening. Ethan maintained overwhelming presence by staying close to Max during required tasks, yet disappeared for unpredictable intervals, leading Max to believe any mistake could be observed, even when Ethan was not visible in the room. The rules restricting food, rest, and movement caused Max to describe his body as losing the ability to distinguish between freedom and restraint, narrowing his mind until it revolved solely around avoiding Ethan's displeasure. Through those conditions, Ethan built a complete system of control that shaped every aspect of Max's existence inside the shelter. Max described that his mental state began to break down layer by layer under the military-style sequence of commands Ethan imposed in the confined space, where every sound echoed very briefly, and each time Ethan spoke, his words bounced off the earthen walls like a signal that had to be obeyed, making Max unable to distinguish whether it was a request or a threat. He said that at first he still tried to hold on to the thought that this was just an abnormal situation and would end, but as Ethan repeated the same commands, with the same rhythm, the same low tone, and the same stress pattern, his mind became conditioned like a recruit placed under high-intensity training, gradually reducing his capacity to resist. When Ethan stepped closer, the thud of boots hitting the dirt floor and the uneven breathing created tense silences right before the next command rang out. Max said that every time he heard the words stand, sit, quiet, his body reacted before his brain could even process it, as though the reflexes had been reprogrammed, and this caused him to slowly lose any sense of choosing actions according to his own will. He described how the fear of punishment shifted his mind each day toward complete submission. Ethan only had to change the rhythm of his footsteps, or place a hand on the binding cord for Max to feel his heart race not from pain, but from a vague dread that he would make a mistake. That very level of fear created the conditions for a distorted belief to form. That if he completed the training, then Ethan would stop, and the outside light would return. Investigators recorded Max's own words as he described this thought process. "I thought that if I did it right, he would let me go. I thought I just had to endure long enough." According to Max, Ethan punished any sign of resistance by tightening the cord so hard that blood vessels throbbed numbly, or by starving him through reducing the MRE portion to just a few small bites, or by increasing the number of heavy tasks in the cramped space, causing prolonged pain in his back and shoulders. Max clearly remembered the moment he was forced to move heavy, damp logs, placing them exactly where Ethan pointed, while his body trembled from exhaustion. Yet Ethan did not allow him to stop. The repeated nature of that punishment shifted Max's psychology from resistance to acceptance, and then to a state he called trying to meet the requirements in order to gain freedom, a belief so distorted that he began to judge every action according to the standards Ethan set, even though he didn't know whether those standards were real or not. When investigators asked about his feelings during those days, Max described that there was no longer any outside light or sound to remind him of reality, only darkness, the faint rolling of stones when Ethan walked past, the rubbing of cord against his wrists, and the steady rhythm of his own breathing. Being cut off from all familiar environmental stimuli caused him to lose the ability to compare information. And in his words, "I no longer knew what was right or wrong, only what made him angry and what made him stay quiet." The complete absence of familiar environmental elements plunged Max's mind into the phase commonly seen in long-term isolation. Loss of judgment ability, distrust of his own memories, and viewing the repeated commands as the only stable structure. Ethan exploited that vulnerability by occasionally giving Max tests, sometimes requiring him to hold balance in difficult postures, sometimes ordering him to arrange items in a preset sequence, and if Max succeeded, Ethan did not punish. This temporary absence of punishment caused Max to misinterpret that he was making progress, thereby further reinforcing the compliance system. When investigators asked about moments he thought he would escape, Max answered that he once believed Ethan would open the shelter door and announce the training was over, and that belief was not hope but the product of a mind being drilled with the same pattern for a long time. That distorted feeling caused Max, whenever Ethan left the shelter, to wait for the sound of his boots returning so he would know he was still in the system. And when Ethan stayed silent too long, Max feared he had done something wrong even though no action had taken place. This was precisely the state that psychological experts call ego dissolution under coercive conditions, and Max expressed it with the sentence, "I no longer knew what I thought. I just tried to do whatever kept him from getting angry." As Ethan maintained restrictions on food, rest, and movement, Max described that his body no longer felt hunger in a normal way, but only a prolonged, mild stomach pain. And when he was given food, he felt as though he had been rewarded, further strengthening the distorted link between compliance and survival. When investigators asked about the most lasting impact, Max said that the constant repetition of commands caused him to no longer distinguish the purpose of actions. He only remembered the tone of command and the reflex to respond. That eroded psychological foundation became the direct precursor to the meaningless words he uttered when he was found, because at that moment his mind was still operating according to the complete await orders mechanism, making him unable to connect reality with memory and language in a normal way. Max recounted that the night marking the beginning of his escape from captivity did not start with any deliberate plan, but originated from an unforeseen incident that even Ethan had not anticipated. When the weather suddenly shifted to heavy rain that poured down onto the makeshift shelter's roof covering, then layer after layer of dry soil began to soften and turn to mud, causing a section of the underground shelter's corner, where Ethan had built a thin wooden reinforcement, to collapse. The sound of falling earth, mixed with cracking wood, shook the entire low space, and Max clearly felt cold water vapor rushing in, making the ground beneath his feet slippery and sinking deeper. Ethan turned on the flashlight to inspect the collapsed area, his movements heavier than usual because the rain caused mud to cling to his boots, and his rapid breathing showed the exhaustion accumulated over many days of controlling Max. That very exhaustion created a rare moment of carelessness when Ethan changed the way he tied Max's bindings, not checking the tightness as meticulously as he did every other day. Max said he noticed the cord was looser within just a few seconds after Ethan turned away, but he didn't dare react immediately because he knew even one inappropriate movement could make Ethan alert again. While Ethan focused on picking up the wet wooden planks and trying to reinforce the collapsed shelter section, Max remained in absolute silence in his bound position, trying to memorize every sound so he could recognize the moment Ethan turned his back, and precisely when the wind and rain created louder noise, he felt he had a few breaths to test how loose the knot had become. In previous times when he had been ordered to clean the dirt floor, Max had once noticed a thin metal fragment half buried in the soil, with a sharp edge like the head of a nail or a broken part of a clip, but back then Ethan was always close, so he never dared touch it. The rainy night was the first time he had the chance, because the rain washed away surface soil and exposed a faint, reflective glint from that metal piece. Max recounted that he had to move his body extremely slowly, rubbing his bound wrists against the dirt floor to probe for the sharp object, and after making contact, he pinched it lightly between his numb fingers, trying to pull it up without making any sound. At that moment, the nylon cord still bound him, but the slack was enough for him to maneuver the metal fragment into the knot section. Max described the process of loosening the cord as a test of both physical strength and willpower, because the rain-soaked nylon knot had tightened further and could only be separated fiber by fiber with extremely slow twisting force. Every time the cord rubbed against his skin, he felt burning pain so intense his vision blurred. Yet he didn't dare let out even a groan, because Ethan was only a few steps away. He had to pause constantly whenever he heard Ethan's footsteps change direction or when the flashlight beam swept near his area. Time passed in extreme tension without any auditory markers to indicate how long it had been. Max only knew that every movement took many minutes to avoid disrupting the rhythm in the confined space. He recounted that the rain outside became an advantage because the sound of falling water masked the small noises he made, and over what felt like an endless stretch of time, the final section of cord finally separated and came free from his wrists. Once Max succeeded in freeing his hands, he had to maintain the original posture, keeping his hands exactly in place so Ethan wouldn't notice any change if he glanced over. Max held that position until Ethan left the collapsed roof area to fetch reinforcing materials from outside the shelter. At that point, Max carefully twisted his wrists to slip the cord off his ankles in the darkness. But because of the awkward position, the process took additional hours, and he had to keep his breathing extremely shallow. When the last cord fell to the dirt floor, Max did not stand up immediately, but instead observed Ethan's movement pattern through the sound of his footsteps. He listened to the intervals between each heavy step, the position of the echoes, and the frequency with which Ethan returned to the shelter entrance area. In previous times, Ethan always took regular pauses when checking the outer structure, and Max relied on that pattern to identify a short window during which Ethan would not return. Max said his legs were trembling so badly he could barely feel his feet, yet he still had to focus on analyzing the wind and water sounds to guess the direction. When Ethan left the shelter to reinforce the collapsed roof, Max seized the opportunity to crawl up the dirt slope, pushing his body up onto the shelter surface. The cold blast hitting his face made him stagger, but also helped him orient himself, because the strong wind gusts blew toward the lower-lying area. He didn't dare run immediately, but hid behind a fallen tree trunk a few meters from the shelter, trying to see where Ethan was. Ethan's flashlight beam illuminated the broken roof section, and at the moment the light pointed away, Max used every ounce of remaining strength to sprint toward the densest part of the forest, where the darkness completely concealed his shape. Max said his legs had almost no feeling left because of the prolonged binding, but adrenaline drove him to run despite the pain as branches scraped his skin. He ran in the direction where his ears picked up the sound of flowing water, because faint remaining memories told him that following a stream could serve as a navigation aid in the forest. When he reached a small stream, Max knelt down, touched the cold surface with his hands, and followed along the water's edge to maintain direction, knowing the current would lead him away from the densest area. Moving through thick darkness with bare feet meant every step carried the risk of tripping on rocks or stepping on sharp objects, but Max said that at that moment his mind was focused solely on getting as far away from Ethan as possible. He carried no food, and paused only to wet his lips with cold water to regain strength. During the days of wandering, Max relied on a few vague terrain markers, such as the shape of leaning tree canopies, and the turns of the stream to confirm he was still heading toward an area with signs of human presence. His body was so exhausted that he collapsed to the ground many times. Yet he forced himself to stand up again because of the haunting fear that Ethan was right behind him. Max recounted that time in the forest stretched on endlessly, every night bitterly cold, while daytime light felt blinding after so long without exposure. Finally, when the stream widened and the sound of stronger flow carried farther, Max realized the terrain was opening up into a transitional zone near old roads, and when he passed a large curved rock resembling a bridge, he glimpsed in the distance the wooden structure that was later identified as the Wawona Covered Bridge area. where he gathered every last bit of remaining strength to move toward it because he believed there would be people there. When the investigation team began verifying Max's statements, they used every detail he recalled about terrain, weather, sounds, and direction of movement to cross-reference with on-site data in order to confirm the plausibility of his escape route. His description of the damp slope near the shelter, where soil collapsed and the wooden roof covering rotted from water, matched the Alder Creek area, which has loose, easily eroded soil, and remnants of the subsidence were still imprinted on the ground surface despite weathering. This aligned with Max's account of heavy rain causing soil to slide down and expose the metal fragment he used to cut the bindings. When the team surveyed the direction Max said he ran, they discovered a natural corridor between fallen logs and brush that had been parted along the path of someone fleeing, with the layer of decayed leaves torn aside in the direction Max described. Although 2 years had passed, scene analysts still found old shoe prints deeply impressed in places where wet soil had pooled. And when compared to the size of Max's feet at the time of his recovery, the deformation caused by barefoot running matched the shape of the indentations. Along the stream course at the base of the slope that Max said he followed, the team found a discarded piece of nylon cord, covered in soil and moss but still bearing strong tension marks on the fibers, indicating it had been forcibly pulled apart. The material properties matched exactly the type recovered from the underground shelter. The discovery of this item reinforced that Max had indeed freed himself from the bindings and fled from that point. When the team expanded the sweep along the watercourse, they located several old discarded items, including a dark fabric scrap very similar to fibers adhered to the shelter floor, a rusted MRE box lid, and a piece of duct tape that had once been wrapped around a wooden stake. Although the fabric piece could not be definitively attributed to anyone, its material and degree of decay matched the type found in samples collected from the shelter, allowing the conclusion that it was highly likely dropped or discarded by Ethan during movement. Additionally, the MRE lid showed the distinctive tearing pattern consistent with the disciplined opening habit already analyzed from evidence inside the shelter, making the location where these items were found a point of confirmation for the route Ethan had used to transport Max or to search for him after discovering his escape. Field technicians also compared Max's description of the cold, slippery ground and the gradually strengthening sound of water in the direction he traveled with the topographic map of the small stream leading toward Wawona. Max's account matched the natural slope of the terrain, the distance from Alder Creek to the Wawona Covered Bridge area, if following the watercourse, and the pace of an exhausted person running continuously. Archived park weather records showed that exactly during the period Max described, a major rain event occurred in the southern Yosemite region, with rainfall heavy enough to cause roof collapse or rot wooden structures. This information corroborated the detail about the incident that forced Ethan to reinforce the shelter and created a lapse in vigilance, enabling Max's escape. The rain intensity matched the soil wash phenomenon observed during the shelter survey, especially in the collapsed foundation area filled with hardened mud. When verifying each point in Max's account, investigators combined the area's GPS maps, old SAR data, and natural water routes to estimate the realistic travel time for a barefoot, malnourished, and panicked person moving from Alder Creek to the vicinity of Wawona. Geographic calculations showed that the route Max described was entirely consistent with the distance such a person could cover over multiple days. Residual water marks remained in low rock hollows where Max may have stopped to drink, aligning with his statement that he only used water to sustain himself. The survey team documented light erosion marks from knees pressing down in the darkness, further matching Max's description. When cross-referencing every element, the shelter roof collapse, scattered military gear, forcibly torn bindings, matching footprints, same type fabric scraps, sounds, and terrain, as Max recounted, all formed a consistent, coherent body of evidence with no illogical points or contradictions. The investigators concluded that the escape route Max described was absolutely plausible in terms of geography, time, physical condition, and natural conditions, thereby lending very high credibility to his statements, and confirming that what Max experienced during his escape journey accurately reflected the real-world terrain that the survey team had proven. When the field evidence matched Max's statement completely, and the escape route was confirmed as reasonable. The investigation team shifted focus to apprehending Ethan Cole, who had been established as the primary suspect. Based on residency data, the tracking team obtained the temporary address Ethan reported after leaving the Yosemite area, showing that he had stayed at an old mobile home park in Fresno County. The location was remote with sparse population, fitting the behavior of someone trying to avoid drawing attention. Investigators pulled Ethan's financial records and reviewed all credit card transactions, fuel purchases, and payments at small stores to reconstruct his movements. Small transactions at roadside gas stations and a grocery store deep in rural Fresno County, appearing in the time period right after Max was found, indicated that Ethan had not left California and was keeping his range of movement very narrow, deliberately avoiding crowded areas. This data helped narrow down the area where he could be hiding and confirmed that the mobile home was his longest stop since leaving Yosemite. Once his pattern of movement became clear, a SWAT team was mobilized to carry out a controlled approach, since Ethan was a former military member with training and the capability to resist strongly. The mobile home area was scouted beforehand using long-range binoculars and infrared equipment, confirming that Ethan was inside alone. The surrounding terrain was dry ground mixed with low brush, allowing the tactical team to deploy in a two-pronged formation. One group moved in silently from the rear, while the other took position to block the front exit and prevent any escape attempt. When the entry time was confirmed over radio, the team knocked hard on the door and announced the arrest warrant according to procedure. There was no response, so the team moved into a ready-to-control posture. As the door was forced open, Ethan suddenly charged out from inside, body tensed, using his arms to try to shove down the tactical team members. He was not carrying any heavy weapon, but his explosive, powerful, and decisive movements were consistent with trained, military close-quarters combat skills, forcing the team to apply joint locks and take him to the ground to subdue him. Ethan resisted for a few seconds with strong jerks, but the well-trained tactical team managed to lock his shoulder joint, force his face down into the dirt, and handcuff him according to procedure. While being restrained, Ethan uttered phrases that were half like drill commands and half like chaotic accusations, showing clear signs of unstable and highly agitated mental state. Immediately after Ethan was secured, the investigative team conducted a search of his residence under a pre-signed warrant. The mobile home was small and old, but inside it contained items characteristic of someone who had spent many days living in the wilderness. Under the bed, officers found a large duffel bag. When opened, it contained several pieces of evidence that significantly matched items recovered from Yosemite. A coil of gray nylon rope of the same fiber type as the sample collected from the shelter, with sections showing tension marks consistent with the ligature marks on Max's wrists. A folding knife with blade wear patterns matching the cut marks on the wooden table in the shelter, and several unused MRE packets of the same type found along Max's escape route. In addition to these items, the search team discovered an old Yosemite map with short, straight, evenly spaced markings, consistent with the style of notation typically used by people with military training to designate guard sectors or movement routes. A piece of dark-colored fabric was also found. Material consistent with the fabric scraps recovered from the shelter, and its presence in Ethan's bag created a clear link between his residence and the site where Max was held. Each piece of evidence was carefully documented, photographed, labeled, and sealed according to forensic protocol for transport to the lab. Once the search was complete, Ethan was escorted to a specialized transport vehicle for immediate transfer to a federal detention facility. Handcuffs remained in place continuously, and the escort team ensured he had no opportunity to endanger anyone during the entire journey. Ethan was taken to federal custody without delay to maintain strict security control and to begin all necessary pretrial procedures for the charged offenses. The federal trial of Ethan Cole drew intense attention when the prosecution opened by presenting the full chain of physical evidence collected during the investigation, starting with the DNA found on the nylon rope in the shelter at Alder Creek, which matched Ethan's biometric record in the federal database completely. Next came the old Yosemite map, with short, evenly spaced straight-line markings that matched Max's description and aligned with the target marking habits of someone with military training. Along with that, sections of stretched nylon rope, consistent with the ligature marks on Max's wrists, military-issue items such as MRE packets, metal hooks, and the wear marks on the wooden table, all scientifically analyzed to show the use of the same tool types and techniques. The prosecution displayed side-by-side images comparing old footprints found along the escape route with Max's bare footprints when he was discovered, pointing out that the distorted shape of Max's feet was consistent with prolonged barefoot running, reinforcing the accuracy of the route he described, and thereby confirming that the timeline and locations fully matched Ethan's prolonged captivity behavior. In addition to the physical evidence, the prosecution presented psychological and medical evidence based on reports from the doctors who treated Max immediately after he was found. Experts described prolonged physical injuries such as severe malnutrition and vitamin D deficiency, indicating Max had been isolated from sunlight, ligature marks matching the nylon rope binding style, repeated trauma to the shoulders and back, showing he had been forced into heavy labor over an extended period. The psychological evidence included signs of trauma bonding, loss of time orientation, and the development of submissive reflexes, triggered by commanding voices, characteristics consistent with victims subjected to long-term behavioral control. The prosecution emphasized that these reports were not speculative, but scientific evidence demonstrating that Max was not only held captive, but also conditioned under a military-style control model imposed by Ethan. When Max took the stand, the courtroom fell into absolute silence to hear the victim's direct account. Max described in detail the sequence of Ethan's criminal behavior according to his recovered memory timeline. The tense encounter at Mist Trail, being followed through the forest, the moment he was knocked unconscious, the disorientation from being blindfolded and bound, and the process of being forced to perform labor and endure repeated punishments inside the shelter. He described Ethan's commanding tone of voice, the sound of military-style footsteps, the restrictions on food, rest, and movement. Every detail matched the crime scene forensic findings, allowing the jury to clearly understand the deliberate cruelty and intent behind the behavior. Max recounted the sensation of having his perception warped over many months to the point where he believed he had to complete the training in order to survive. The statements from Ethan that he recalled always revolved around teaching a lesson about respect, showing that the motive was not impulsive but the result of Ethan's personal revenge-driven psychological distortion. When it was Ethan's turn to present his defense, his attorney argued that Ethan suffered from severe PTSD after leaving the military, and that triggers such as Max's alleged mocking remarks about the military caused Ethan to react with excessive self-defense. They contended that Ethan had no intention of causing prolonged harm, and only wanted to teach a lesson so Max would understand respect for military service, stressing that PTSD impaired his ability to control his behavior. Ethan himself spoke, voice tense, attempting to argue that he only wanted Max to learn the value of discipline and had no intent to cause serious injury. However, when the prosecution asked why he had to hold Max for nearly 2 years, force him to labor, restrict food, light, and rest, Ethan could offer no reasonable answer beyond repeating that it was part of the lesson. The prosecution countered the PTSD argument by presenting Ethan's meticulously prepared records. Renting the cabin at the same time Max went hiking, bringing a tactically marked map, using nylon rope, digging the shelter, preparing military rations, and arranging items according to a control pattern. The prosecution asserted that these actions were not spontaneous but required systematic planning and execution, ruling out the possibility of complete loss of control as claimed by the defense. The jury deliberated over all the evidence for several days, analyzing the degree of intent, the level of preparation, and the extent of prolonged harm. They concluded that PTSD could not justify the acts of captivity, binding, psychological conditioning, and forced labor over an extended period, especially given that Ethan had sufficient awareness to cover his tracks, move tactically, and avoid detection for nearly 2 years. They determined that this was deliberate, punitive behavior carried out using a systematic application of military skills to maintain control over Max. With the unified chain of physical, psychological, and testimonial evidence, Together with the assessment that the level of harm fell into the most serious category under federal kidnapping and detention statutes, the court reached a verdict, identifying the corresponding federal offenses, including interstate kidnapping, prolonged unlawful detention, and infliction of serious bodily injury to the victim, paving the way for the sentencing phase under the federal sentencing guidelines. The sentencing hearing for Ethan Cole was held in federal court, with the jury, prosecution representatives, defense counsel, Max's family, and numerous independent observers present. As the judge stood to read the decision, the entire chain of evidence reviewed throughout the trial was summarized to determine the degree of Ethan's criminal culpability. The DNA evidence recovered from the nylon rope in the shelter, the Yosemite map marked in a military style, the MRE items, the binding marks matching the injuries on Max's wrists, together with the victim's precise testimony, all formed the solid basis for the charges that the prosecution presented to the court. The official conclusion was delivered. Ethan Cole was found guilty of first-degree kidnapping under federal law, the most serious offense in the category of kidnapping crimes, consistent with his use of physical force, prolonged detention, and long-term harm inflicted on the victim. In addition to the primary charge, the court imposed supplementary convictions, including prolonged unlawful detention, infliction of serious bodily injury, and the use of military skills to carry out harmful conduct. The full listing of additional charges was not intended to stack penalties, but to accurately reflect the prolonged, premeditated, and systematic nature of Ethan's behavior. In explaining the reasons for applying a severe sentencing range, the judge analyzed that the gravity of the case far exceeded the typical indicators of an impulsive kidnapping. Ethan had proactively surveilled Max, selected the opportune moment at missed trail, employed restraint techniques, transported the victim to a pre-prepared holding location, and maintained a pattern of psychological, physical, and daily life control for nearly 2 years. This conduct did not merely cause immediate harm but also eroded Max's entire mental structure, forcing him to live in a conditioned state resembling a recruit subjected to extreme training conditions. These factors led the court to completely reject all requests for leniency from the defense. One critical point the judge emphasized was that the PTSD argument could not serve as a basis for sentence reduction because investigative evidence demonstrated that despite any psychological trauma, Ethan retained the capacity to plan, conceal his actions, manage resources, and apply military techniques in a systematic manner. This meant Ethan possessed sufficient awareness to understand his conduct and still deliberately carried it out. The court further ruled that a distorted perception of teaching a lesson could not be considered a mitigating circumstance, especially when the conduct involved holding the victim in cruel conditions, restricting light, limiting food intake, and trading away Max's mental health throughout the entire period of captivity. Based on the factors outlined above, the court imposed a total sentence of 52 years in federal prison, with no parole, no leniency, and no reduction of time served in any form. This sentence was determined according to the sentencing guidelines for first-degree kidnapping in cases involving severe aggravating circumstances, including prolonged duration of confinement, permanent injury, and the use of specialized skills to commit the offense. The pronounced sentence reflected the court's view that society must be protected from small-scale but highly cruel organized conduct while ensuring that the victim and his family received formal recognition from the justice system. When the sentence was announced, Max's family representatives received official notification in the courtroom, and their reaction reflected a mixture of relief and lingering sorrow upon learning that the chain of brutal acts had been adjudicated in accordance with the law. The public was also informed through an official statement from the federal court and investigating agencies, ensuring full transparency of the entire legal process and preventing any misinformation about the case. The release of the outcome was not intended to generate publicity, but to preserve the integrity of information concerning a case that had shocked the hiking community and residents around Yosemite. As soon as the judgment took effect, the National Park Service updated the case file in its Resolved Incident Database, documenting the full investigative process, legal conclusions, suspect identification, and the circumstances under which the victim was located. This database became part of the reference system used for missing persons cases in national park environments, strengthening future response capabilities to similar offenses. The case file was formally closed in accordance with procedure. After the judge signed confirmation of the judgment's finality, evidence was archived per federal forensic regulations, and all records were transferred to the long-term judicial data repository, marking the complete legal conclusion of this nearly 2-year prolonged kidnapping. When the entire judgment was finalized and Ethan Cole was permanently deprived of his freedom within the federal system, psychological experts began a deeper analysis of Max's state of perception to decode the strange statement he uttered at the moment he was found at Wawona Covered Bridge, a statement that bewildered those who discovered him because it did not fit the context of his escape. "I think I was allowed to come back." According to professional assessment, this is a classic example of the psychological dependency mechanism that forms after prolonged captivity, when the victim endures many months of absolute control over space, time, rations, tasks, and movement. Psychologists refer to this state as a submissive compliance loop, a cycle of submission in which the victim's perception is gradually distorted to align with the logic imposed by the captor. In the environment Ethan created, where every action Max took was regulated by military-style commands, punishment, and sensory control, Max's brain gradually shifted from resistance to adaptation for survival, and it was this very adaptation that eroded his ability to distinguish between self-determined actions and actions forced upon him. Experts point out that when an individual is kept in darkness long enough to completely lose the day-night cycle, is conditioned by voice commands, is stripped of the ability to make choices, and lives dependent on the permission of the controller, they can develop a distorted belief that freedom, if it comes, must also be granted. This explains why, in the moment Max first saw daylight and other human beings after 2 years, his mind did not register that he had escaped through his own survival effort. Instead, he interpreted it through the familiar model, a moment that was permitted. When that statement is cross-referenced with the entire captivity process and the forced training model Ethan applied, investigators and experts recognized a unilaterally warped psychological structure. Ethan assumed the role of the one in authority. Max had to wait for orders, and Max's entire survival inside the shelter revolved around obeying commands to avoid punishment. Max's belief that he was allowed to come back did not reflect reality. It reflected the perceptual world Ethan had constructed inside him for nearly 2 years. Results from neurological testing and psychological interview records showed that Max was heavily affected by coercive conditioning, a mechanism in which repeated forms of psychological violence cause the victim to view compliance as the only means of staying alive. When Ethan disappeared from Max's sight on that rainy night, the victim still carried the logic that every action required approval, because the brain region responsible for distinguishing danger from safety had been reshaped according to a dependency pattern. Therefore, even though Max had used a piece of metal to cut his restraints, waited for the right moment to escape, and ran for many days without food, his mind still decoded that survival as a correct consequence of having done enough to be released. Experts consider this clear evidence of the devastating impact of prolonged control and psychological violence. It does not only cause physical harm, but also strips away the ability to self-define one's own actions. They describe this as a distinctive mark of victims held long-term in isolated environments under the domination of an individual skilled at imposing rigid discipline. Synthesizing the entire investigation and trial results, the true nature of the case was not an accidental disappearance, not an impulsive act of violence, but a tightly organized sequence of behavior driven by personal retribution, fueled by the pathological psychology of the perpetrator. Every piece of evidence, from DNA, footprints, the marked map, the structure of the shelter, the binding system, Max's matching testimony, to his conditioned psychological state, built a unified picture of a cruel, prolonged captivity in which the victim not only lost freedom, but also had his perception deformed. As the case closed legally, the final public question turned toward Max. What would his life be like after escaping that prolonged psychological hell? According to reports from treating physicians, Max's recovery process is underway through trauma therapy, safe exposure therapy, cognitive behavioral restoration, and regular social support, Max is gradually re-establishing his ability to distinguish danger from safety, rebuilding his sense of time, and becoming accustomed to making personal decisions without being dominated by submissive reflexes. Though the recovery path is long and cannot erase all traces of the time spent in captivity, Max has begun step by step to rebuild his life living in a quiet place, surrounded by family and professionals, learning to view his escape action as a courageous choice rather than a permission granted. And the very fact that he can now rename that action is the first evidence that his perception is being reclaimed after those dark years. The story of Max Carter and the nearly 2 years he spent imprisoned in the darkness of Yosemite is not only a personal tragedy but also reflects dangers present in American life today, where mental stress, post-combat trauma, social isolation, and minor community conflicts can escalate into uncontrolled violent behavior if not recognized and intervened in time. The case of Ethan Cole shows that PTSD, when left unaddressed and untreated, can become the foundation for dangerous, distorted perceptions. His misinterpretation of Max's mocking words as an insult to military honor, which then developed into a motive for prolonged punishment, reflects the urgent, real need in the United States to care for the mental health of veterans, a group that still faces significant stigma and barriers to services. The lesson here is not fear, but warning. Unresolved psychological issues do not disappear. They accumulate and can produce severe consequences for the entire community. From Max's side, the process of being deprived of freedom, conditioned through commands, and having his perception warped is a powerful reminder of how fragile the human mind is in the face of psychological violence. The United States is a nation that highly values the individual, but this story reminds us that no one is completely immune to isolation and manipulation. Abnormal signs, a person changing behavior, withdrawing, losing orientation, are signals that the community, friends, and family need to pay attention to, not ignore. Finally, Max's escape journey from cutting the ropes in darkness to following the water flow to find his way back is a lesson in survival resilience. In a high-pressure American society, sometimes the feeling of being trapped, disoriented, or controlled can arrive in less extreme but still very real ways. Max's story reminds us that even a small action, a step toward the light, can open the door to survival. If you feel that Max Carter's story has given you a new perspective on the power of survival and the importance of looking out for one another in the community, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any more authentic journeys like this. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video, where we continue to explore stories that make the entire United States pause and reflect.